and the assembly agreement. So I'm going to read the assembly agreements right now. Okay, so what we do is every time we open up the space, we have some agreements and some common themes and to set the environment and the mood of the assembly. So the first agreement is speak your truth. The other one is acknowledge lived experience. The other one is experience is priority. Mute your sound. Mute your phones. Stories stay, lessons leave. Recognize privilege. And be mindful of language. So with those being read and those being said, and by the way, the brother's going to read some principles that we live by in the next segment here. So those are other things we're going to agree on and that we've agreed on for the past sessions. So with those agreements being read, everybody raise your hand in acknowledgement of those agreements. Yes, 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 yes. Okay, great. All right, our panel is going to be right here. And let's see, hold on. All right, and that's all I got for now. So then I'm going to hand it over to the brother.
Hey, thanks for coming, everybody. My name is Marjaan. Spelled Marjaan, but it's pronounced Marjaan, like a mermaid. I keep correcting folks. So I've been here in the community for 13 years. I'm on 40th, and I just want to, I'm going to frame this conversation before Malik introduces the panel, but hey, Carmen, welcome. So one of the reasons why we're here, and a lot of folks are acknowledging this, obviously, we started organizing this in response to the murder of George Floyd. And a lot of folks have acknowledged, like, we wouldn't be here if the city didn't get destroyed, right? A lot of folks would have went on with their day. And this is work that a lot of folks, such as Sandra Richardson and others here who have been around for decades, they've been doing this work and trying to bring these issues to the forefront and prevent such a tragedy. And so the way we try to frame this conversation is, this is bigger than police brutality, right? This is bigger than one murder. George Floyd's killing was really the tipping point. But we've been battling racial poverty forever in the city. We've been battling sophisticated versions of racial apartheid, or Jim Crow as we refer to it in the United States. And there's a dear friend, community member by the name of Ann Winkler Morey. She was my professor a few years back at Metro State. And she's been working on a project called the Minneapolis Interview Project. Has anybody read any of the stories? She's been interviewing leaders throughout the city. I think her goal is to interview 100 leaders. But I just want to read a quick little excerpt that she wrote. She just published a new piece about the Minneapolis uprising, and I encourage everybody to check it out. It's at turtleroad.org. And she's put together a timeline of the protests and the actions. And we're here because of people power. We have to take the power back from the politicians who created such awful conditions that allow Black people to get murdered and justice to be denied to whole communities, right? So her new piece, again, it's on turtleroad.org. It's called The Minneapolis Uprising. She says, after the burning of whole avenues, Minnesota National Guards imposed a week of curfews and roamed our streets, threatening neighbors on their porches. Instead of staying inside, Blacks organized to protect their neighbors, filling rather than emptying the streets. The carcass of a police precinct building and people policing themselves stood as indications of a city ready to uproot the current power structure. While some in the media depicted the city as out of control, one survey in Newsweek found that a majority in the United States thought it was justified to burn a police precinct notorious for abuse. I thought she really articulated what's going on well. And we have to understand that the police do what they've been asked to do. They can be an easy scapegoat, right? But we have to challenge the conditions that require this form of policing. And this country is rooted in private property, valuing private property over human lives. And they use all kinds of systems to enforce this, including the church, especially the white church, right? But corporations, politicians, and individuals, right, who are not conscious of racial justice, right? We police each other in many forms, and the Minneapolis Police Department is just the most violent enforcement of that, right? So we got to have a broader conversation about what are we abolishing? Because if our narrow focus on abolishing the police, I tell you what, America loves the police more than they love black people. White people love private property more than they love black people. Let's be real. So we have to frame this in the lens that racial apartheid is finally falling. We need to dismantle it. This arrangement needs to end. The arrangement of extracting wealth from black, brown, and indigenous bodies and land and transferring it into white communities and building the system and maintaining the system of racial capitalism and white supremacy. That's how we have to frame it. And the police are a major component to oversee that arrangement. This has been a battle for land for 400 years in this country. And it's playing out here in the Bryant Central neighborhoods, right? So, this is part one of a two-part conversation today. We're going to reimagine 38th in Chicago. And black folks who have been born and raised in this community, who have pioneered this community, will tell you what 38th Street used to feel like and how can we really revive such a sense of community rooted in economic determination for black folks, right? So next week, we'll talk about reimagining safety around 38th in Chicago. And I know, folks are going to want to, connect the dots, right? We can't have a thriving market and business corridor and cultural corridor without protecting people first and foremost, enterprise second, right? So part two, next week, we'll have a panel to answer a lot of questions around defund, abolition, and the root of community safety and how do we reimagine that. But one thing we do know is nearly all our crime is domestic, right? Violence is usually domestic, and police, they're not experts on preventing domestic violence. They're there to take reports and clean up after. Most crime in this community has been driven by the prohibition, not of drugs, of black people. Black people have been forced into the underground economy, and black people have always been innovative people, right? So we find ways to make money when we're forced out of the mainstream economy. It blew my mind when I took Keith Mays' African American history class about a decade ago, and he told me during slavery you could buy cotton on the underground in the black market. That blew my mind. Black folks invented the underground market in this country, right? Black folks have always managed to get some resources for themselves and take care of themselves. White folks called it stealing. Black folks said, no, that's our wealth. Those are our resources. And today, 150 years after the fall of slavery, that's still two very different worlds we're living in. Black folks have a perspective that the wealth in this country belongs to us just as much as it belongs to anybody else. And white folks don't quite get that. They believe that they built their own wealth on their own merits and their own sweat and labor. So we're going to take y'all through this journey. We're building a training that we want to institutionalize in this community, a permanent anti-racist training center, so we can offer free training to folks in this community so we can turn these conversations into real action. So again, thank you for coming. I'm going to pass it back to Malik. He's going to moderate, and then we got a great panel. Oh. I'm sorry, real quick before I pass it back to Malik, I just want to ground us in our 4 foundational organizing principles. We've been doing this work prior to the murder of George Floyd and prior to the COVID-19 global pandemic. One of the first principles is all Black lives matter. Whether you're born here or you're born somewhere else, you're cisgender, transgender, queer, straight, poor, middle class, upper class, all Black lives matter. Listen to Black people. It seems revolutionary in a white supremacist society, but it ain't rocket science, that's for sure. Listen to Black people. Break bread with your neighbor. People get that in theory. They get that from their spiritual faith, but people don't get that in real practice in a racial capitalist society, right? People see that through the lens of charity. And no, we have to shift that to mutual aid, reciprocal relationships with each other, right? Break bread with your neighbor. It's a foundation in Christianity and Islam and Judaism, right? But they want to call it communism to keep us all divided. Last principle is community accountability. As a cisgender straight Black male who was born in poverty and grew up Muslim, like I have a very unique perspective of the way I see the world, and I need to be surrounded by people who can help me see other perspectives, as we all do. So, all right, thanks for coming, y'all. Here go Malik.
Okay, we got an exciting panel. We're gonna get started here. So I'm gonna on 38th in Chicago, reimagining it, and then after the panel discussion, then we're gonna break out into our groups again, and we have some renewed questions. Keep that conversation going, and then looking at those midweek assemblies to do it on your block to keep the work going. So got a lot of work to do. And then lastly, we're going to end off in next steps. So we got a lot of those as well. So I'm going to call up a couple of the panelists right now, and wherever you sit here, we got a mic that can go around as well. First panelist to come up, Carmen. And then I'm going to get Sandra Richardson up as well. All right, we have our panel. All right, round of applause for our panel. So we have Sandra Richardson from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond North. Hand for her. Okay, she's going to ground us in establishing an anti-racist training institute on 38th East 38th Street. And then we have Carmen Means, CANDO director and contracted director for our organization, BNO. We're very aligned. Executive director, reimagining the market coming at the end of July through August. So she's going to talk about that, and I'm going to ask them a series of questions. Hand for Carmen. And then I was supposed to be on the panel, but so I'm going to be playing a dual role here. So we'll see. I'm not going to go back and forth, but I'll get in at the last minute here. So, okay, so we're going to start with the first question.
To make sure I answer the question right. My stake in 38th in Chicago, I have a dual with that. My personal is I want to see Black folks clearly be able to exemplify a living of equity, right? That's my personal. My professional is I want to see black folks clearly on 30. We have the cute picture that we have adjusted. And I know that is now being challenged in what equity actually looks like. And as we look over our city, we see Lake Street. And we know that numbers and dollars are rolling into Lake Street. We see Broadway. We know numbers and dollars, not as much as Lake Street has rolled in that area as well, but we also know what North Minneapolis is becoming and looking like, Franklin and so forth. My question is, if indeed we believe as a state, as liberal, as we say that we are, meaning that we have more progressive in thought, where are the black folks? Where are the black folks in home ownership? Them are the real question. Where are the black folks in entrepreneurship? Where are the black folks in generational wealth? And I think neighborhoods that have had the pleasure of being the birthing place of black folks also now have the opportunity to connect that circle and now become the birthing place of reimagining, revitalization, the truly defining what re-urbanization mean, minus the gentrification that they actually began to put into that word, and us really being a community that can model being the place that break what I call generational poverty. And not generational poverty just being in our pocketbook, but also understanding that white supremacy, that is the foundation of where this generational poverty came from. So how do we break that, and how do we be that model? And that does not mean it has to be a community of black folks only. But damn it sure enough means that it cannot be a community that minus black folks, right? And so that's what my stake means in 38th Street. So I'm hoping that 38th Street will be the launching pad, as we know that it is the opportunity given to us by the universe. Everybody's watching. I mean, literally everybody. And as my mother would say, and they mama. They're watching. So what do we do with this opportunity that has been granted, that we now can be the model of change that we first can eat from and be able to extend that towards others?
All right, Sandra, same question. What is your stake in 38th and Chicago?
Everything that Carmen said, but also adding the context that it's a relaunch. It's a relaunch. This is a community that, if you look back, this was a community of black people who were striving black folks. We had the first black city council person from the South Side, Sharon Sales Belton, came from the 8th Ward. First mayor came from here. Brian Herrick came from here. In the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s, this little swatch of South Minneapolis, you had black leadership. You had black people who were looking to move levers of power and weren't afraid to use them. And so when I'm thinking about what my stake is in 38th Street, my stake in 38th Street is in the entire community. 38th Street, 38th in Chicago is the symbol of that. But what we're really looking for is black leadership again. We had black people who were ministers, who were postal workers, who worked at Honeywell, we had black police officers who lived in the neighborhood, so you knew who they were. And we had an economic foundation that was not entirely dependent on white people. And I think that when we think about what 38th Street can be, what it can become, the leadership that came from this community needs to come from black folks in this community again. And I look around and I see that it's possible. I also see, when I look at 38th in Chicago, it's a line in the sand. Either we reclaim now or we don't. And so, although I look out here now and I see a lot of people who are invested, I also need to know that if you're a white person and you're really invested, then you're invested in following black leadership, okay? Because we don't need saviors, okay? We don't need people to tell us what we really know and what things really mean and what's really intended. If you're really invested, if Black lives really matter, then it does call for a cultural shift in this community. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that cultural shift.
Next question. Thank you. What would you like to? Oh, hey, all right. Okay. Tina's here. All right. Round for Tina. All right. I was funny. Tina, introduce yourself. Sure. And what is your stake in 38th in Chicago?
Okay, my name is Tina Burnside, and I'm the co-founder of the Minnesota African American Heritage Museum and Gallery. I'm also a civil rights attorney, and I also was born and raised in the central neighborhood. So, and my family still owns a home here in the neighborhood, and we have been in this neighborhood for over 50 years. And so my stake in the neighborhood is the same as Carmen's and the same as Sandra's. As I said, I've been a long time resident. My family has been a long time resident. And so, like Sandra, I remember the days of Black leadership, and I also remember the days of Black businesses. And at that time, back in the day, the Black Business District was 38th and 4th. And so we had thriving Black businesses where we had two grocery stores. We had one on 38th and 4th, which was Mr. Rubin's, and we had one on 36th and 4th, which was Mr. May's. We also had upholstery stores. We had upholstery cleaners. We had barbershops. We had beauty shops. We had record stores. We had restaurants. And so it was a thriving economic development of Black businesses in the historic South Side. And that went on from about the 20s to about the 70s. And so my stake is, like Sandra and like Carmen have said, is seeing that revitalized and seeing that come back and seeing that the South Side again thrives.
All right, thank you. All right, good to see Tina. So the next question is, what would you like to see at 38th in Chicago permanently? And now we're going to start off this time with, let's start with Tina.
What I would like to see is that become also a thriving economic development center of Black businesses. And one of the things that that I was going to talk about later on, and we can get more into it, is about community investment co-ops. And we had talked about that when I used to also be a member of the CANDO board. And Eduardo Cardenas, when he was on the board and I was on the board, we had talked about starting up a community investment co-op. And that's where the community starts an institution and everyone pulls their money and puts money into this co-op so that we have financial power and economic power in order to buy the commercial structures and also commercial buildings and residential buildings in the neighborhood. Because what has happened now is that the ownership of a lot of the commercial properties are not owned by Black people. And so in order to have Black businesses, you have to own those buildings, because otherwise, if you're just leasing, when the new owner or the owner doesn't want your business there, they can put you out. And so that's one of the things that we had talked about when I was on the CANDO board, is talking about these community investment co-ops. And we had looked at in Northeast, they have one called the Northeast Investment Co-op. And so they're kind of like the model in Minnesota on their neighborhood got together and they identified either vacant businesses or commercial properties or businesses that were not good community partners or absentee landlords. And they looked at forming this co-op and pulling the resources of the community to purchase these, and then the co-op owned them, and then they would put in businesses that they thought were good partners. And so I think that that's something that we should think about doing to build up 38th in Chicago as a Black business district.
All right, thank you. All right, Sandra, what would you like to see at 38th in Chicago permanently? And then lastly, the thing I want to add on to that question is I appreciate you kind of modeling it, Tina. Let's get specific as we're talking about that. So
I'd like to see several things. I think it's a mistake to just say, okay, well, we're just going to put Black businesses there, okay? Because we already know that what usually happens is that Black businesses are started, they're under-resourced, they're undercapitalized, and they fail within 12 to 24 months. And so in addition to adding on to what Tina said in terms of if you don't own it, they can disappear you at any time. If you don't know how to own it, they can disappear you at any time. So I also, when I think about that corner, I think about, okay, entrepreneurship training. I think about business incubation. I think about that definitely in direct connection with Anti-Racist Leadership Institute that we're going to talk about in a minute. So I won't get into that part right now. But I see that we need to create an entirely different ecosystem than what we have going right now. And we need to create, not just at 38th Street, but when we think about Black business and building Black wealth, we need to create the ecosystem because it's not there for us. So,
Thank you.
So I can talk about the memorial, but we can do that.
All right. Carmen?
Just to echo what Miss Tina and what Miss Sandra said, I mean, that exclamation point, right? Also, to add to that as well, to really, I think yesterday in the meeting that we had, we talked about culture, Trump strategy. I think that, and I believe that is some of the things that Ms. Sandra just was speaking of as well, in order to have the longevity and the sustainability to see this thing for generations. The culture in which we're creating right now has to begin to be the new norm for 38th Street. It has to begin to, for so long, to be able to say we want Black businesses. It felt like in the atmosphere that we were saying, but I don't want brown businesses. Or Black Lives Matter, in a sense, feels like, well, I'm saying that it doesn't, if the atmosphere wanted us to believe that it felt like, well, that means that I'm saying that you're like, no, that's not what we're saying at all. But to be very intentional now about what the ask is, and to be very intentional about what longevity looks like. If the anti-racism, because we know that that structure is there now because of white supremacy. So if the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute is not put there, and there is a steady teaching about white supremacy, remember, this thing had years to be planted. This is not centuries. And this is not one of those cute plants like I got from Trader Joe's that doesn't require watering, but it still grows. No, this thing is intentional. Evil is strategic. It's strategic. It's intentional. It's watered. So how do we spend now centuries in that atmosphere, in an institution, that we make that become part of the learning so that we can see the structural buildings and the things that we know that we are reimagining, and that you say the relaunch, because really we may be reimagining, but our forefathers and our ancestors already seen this, and they did this. Let's be clear, and they did this. So how do we build a building but also build a system? So we need to have like a spiritual awakening, if you will. And spiritual to me does not just speak to my personal faith. I'm talking about the universe. I'm talking about the mountains. I'm talking about the trees. The awakening that as we are building structure, we are also dismantling. So what we cannot afford to do is build the structure without doing the work of dismantling. So 38th Street has to be the place of dismantling as we see going up. So it's almost brick by brick the build up, brick by brick the tear down. And that has to become a torch that is older, and she's coaching. There is now an atmosphere that has picked up that it is no longer that our history is also being projected in our future as our build up is happening. So this thing has to be done very ambidextrous in the way that we move, but at 38th Street is definitely what I see that thing can be done at.
Okay, thank you. And for this next question, I'm going to go to Sandra next. What have you heard from the Black community members about the future of 38th in Chicago?
I've heard several things. One is what I've heard most clearly in a variety of different ways from people is that they do not want things to go back to what was. So what was on May 24th, people have absolutely zero interest in going back to. So that's number one. Second of all, they want to see, this has sparked, not just in Minneapolis, not just in Minnesota, but like someone said yesterday, okay, when they are protesting in Athens, Greece, on behalf of George Floyd, okay, we're part of a worldwide movement, and we need to recognize this moment. And people are at different levels, but on a, I don't know, cellular level, I guess is the best way of saying it, is that people are saying we cannot go back and we have to, this has to be a moment of transformation. So people want to see something that affirms George Floyd's life, and they want to see something that says no more. People want to see cup foods gone. Now, not everybody, but people want to see, they don't want to see things going back to the same old, the way they were on that corner, the way they were at that intersection. That this has to be the start of something new. And we have to demand that. We have to demand that. People want that from their city leaders. I know people are calling their council people. They're calling their county commissioners. They're talking about it in their church groups. That they want to be something different. And a lot of people don't know how to be something different. But they want to be something different, and they want to be a part of something different. And so I think that for those of us who are meeting in groups like this, and those of us who are meeting in other spaces, are recognizing that and are hearing that.
All right, thank you. I'll go to Tina next.
I agree with what Sandra said, that people are looking to not go backwards, but to go forward. And one of the things that I'm hearing a lot, besides all the things that Sandra touched on, is that people don't want Black people to be left out again, because that is what always seems to happen, is when things happen, that there's this move for change, or this move for reinvestment, or this move for reimagining something, but it's always in different communities and never within the Black community or historic Black community and neighborhoods. And so people are like, we need to be not just at the table, but the voices that are being heard and the voices that are being listened to, and the people making the changes and the decisions.
Thank you. All right, Carmen.
What I've heard was really everything, once again, that Miss Sandra, Miss Tina has spoken of, but it's also this underlining fear of, will the white folks become sleep again? Will this moment pass us by? And so we often find ourselves having to resist against the need to be hasty, and acknowledge that if we are too hasty, we can move in hastiness and forget the power of strategy. So that is, as our white allies and our sisters and brothers that are sitting here listening, make sure your hearts heard that piece. And if, as the work that Miss Sandra has been doing for years, anti-racism work is not your work, that fear will become a reality. So Black folks is very much so concerned about this opportunity. It's not a dismiss of the tragic and the lost on all sectors. Neither is it a dismiss of being able to having to have this fight in the midst of a pandemic, COVID-19. And so it is the much needed desire to not let this moment pass us by. And how do we steward this moment to produce change? It's now I believe personally what I've seen, I hate poverty. I hate it. I hate it because in so many levels, it takes away your ability to dream. It's hard to thrive and survive at the same time. And I'm coming from a woman that grew up in an impoverished area, right? And so when you have and understand how the connection with supremacy is as Black folks, and having the ability to dream, it was something about this moment on May 25th that in the midst of lynching, the rage sparked an ability to dream again. right? It sparked in the middle of the lynching, it sparked the anger, it sparked the acknowledgement, it sparked the encompassing of the emotions, but it began to lift the veil of poverty just for a moment to say, yo, I can do better, we can do better, let's do this. We know that that was the sparking of our ancestors, but now we're beginning to see, let's make this happen. So I'm not from Missouri, but black folks is like, show me. And they're moving from show me to we gonna do this, right? I don't need your permission, but let's do this.
All right, thank you. That was amazing. What are the biggest obstacles to transforming that corner? The corner. I'm going to start with Tina this time. Biggest obstacles.
I think some of the biggest obstacles are one which has already been mentioned is cup foods. They've been in the neighborhood for a very long time, but they haven't been what I would call a good community partner. And so they're going to be an obstacle to changing that corner. Also, there's different agendas. Everybody has a different agenda. And so politicians have an agenda, individuals have an agenda, businesses that are already there have an agenda. So everyone has an agenda, and so that's going to be a challenge in trying to get everyone on the same page, or at least to buy into what we're trying to do here. And so those are going to be some of the challenges. And then when we talk about economic development, getting the capital, as we had talked about before, in order to open businesses and sustain businesses. And then as Sandra had mentioned, also getting the training, because a lot of times people may have a great idea for a business, but if they don't know what it takes to run a business and to sustain a business, that's going to be problematic, because then you'll just have constant turnover. And so, so there also needs to be some training and some development so that people are ready to go in and have sustainable businesses.
All right, let's go with Sandra next. Biggest obstacles.
So I want to come at it from just a little bit different perspective, because I think that one of the biggest obstacles to transforming that corner is also the biggest obstacles that we have to transforming our society, that we have to transforming our culture. We keep saying that we are a culture and a society that's built on white supremacy, but I don't think we necessarily always recognize that in the day-to-day. And so you can, with the best of intentions, with your whole heart and wanting to do good for everyone, but if you are not operating clearly on anti-racist principles and you don't have an understanding of what racism really is, whatever it is that you dismantle and recreate will still disproportionately benefit white people and will disproportionately benefit the current power structure. And so a lot of times when we talk about, we're Minnesotans, so we got a lot of words. You know, we talk a lot, but the real work of transformation is, if we're really going to make change on that corner and in this community, then it has to go beyond the symbolic. It has to go beyond, okay, we're going to change a few names. We're going to put up a sign that says George Floyd Boulevard. But we really have to have an understanding of what racism is. We really have to have an understanding of what white supremacy is. We really have to have an understanding of what internalized white superiority is. We have to have an understanding of what racial inferiority is internalized. Because if you look at social change and social movements across this country, okay, where it always fails, where it always breaks down, okay, is behind race. Because we never get to a fundamental level of dealing with race. You can look at it across any social movement in this country. You can look across it, social movements current. They're breaking down around race, okay? People who have been silent aren't silent anymore. And so as we talk about what we're gonna do, if we're really not going to do the work. And this is why I think the Anti-Racist Institute is so important, because you have to institutionalize it within the culture of the community. Otherwise, when Carmen goes away, or Marjaan goes away, or Holly goes away, someone goes away, then it goes away. And things go back to what they were, and the number 5 is now blowing exhaust fumes where, George Floyd died. And so we really have to think about, are you in for the long haul? Are you in for the distance? Are you just in for the selfie?
All right, thank you. Well, we're going to go to Carmen next. Biggest obstacles.
Yes. Once again, to piggyback and to just highlight and put in bold and italics what Miss Tina said and what Miss Sandra said. So hear that, let that pierce where it needs to pierce, and penetrate where it needs to penetrate. This thing called white supremacy, that thing runs deep, so deep that we even begin to see our own that begins to believe the lies. Our now ancestor Harriet Tubman said, "I would have freed more if they just known that they were slaves." And some of the structuring that has to be done, that's going to be lifelong work, will be the derooting or uprooting of supremacy. Again, because what can happen so quickly, to be honest, if we formulated the right ask, right? Got in front of the right camera and was endorsed by the right person, in the matter of moments, we would get every dollar that is needed to change that corner aesthetically, right? How do you change a corner culturally? How do you change a system? My mentor, Reverend Alika Galloway, said this. She said, baby, you have to learn certain systems are not worth fighting. You have to learn which systems you burn down and which systems you build up. And we're in the place now that we have to focus on the build up and the burn down, but really to understand organizing. And in this moment, the right ask will produce the right dollars. We're seeing millions of dollars being, literally people are going to sleep with the capacity and the infrastructure of one employee and literally have woken up to millions of dollars in their account with the right ask. So that doesn't mean that you are not going to be needed upon that, or we are not going to be needed upon that ask. But what it does mean is that's the easy part. The work is the longevity of the work. That's what it does. And so that white supremacy, and I hope that this does not become old and tiresome, but that work of uprooting and anti-racism work is the structural foundation that is needed for the sustainability for what we're reimagining. Unless we're just wasting our time right now. Where we are literally doing this to make ourselves feel good in the moment, only to be frustrated tomorrow because dreams that you are not able to dream out and come to pass becomes your nightmares. And so that anti-racism work has to be done. And anti-blackness work. Let's talk anti-blackness work. We don't like to talk about that. How white supremacy has taught others, everybody, they can't stand black folks. So there is a lot of deconstruction has to be done before the construction is done. Construction is the easy part, right? But the deconstruction of the mind will be where a lot of the work and where the frustration and where the tears is going to come from.
Thank you. All right. So I'm going to stay with Carmen on this next question. And how can we secure the capital we need to bring communities' visions to fruition?
I think the key word in this has to be community. When I bring myself to the table, I don't leave pieces back. I'm clear about what my personal agenda is and what I believe, but I also bring my heart and my structure of being able to listen, right? And so the key word here is community. We can't speak on behalf of the community if we are first not clear on what the community needs. If we're not clear about what the community desires, needs and wants is two different things. And so dream is such a big word. And so when we are clear about what is the vision, the capital will follow. When we're clear about what is the ask, the capital will follow. And I'm thinking that he asked me to go first because I talked the longest, but it's cool.
Nobody knows capital like you do. No, anyways. So I'm going to pass it over now to Sandra in the same question. How can we secure the capital we need to bring community visions to fruition? And as you're speaking into the mic, hold it down a little bit because I love reverb, but
I'm
we want to hear
sorry, I
it.
can't
That's all
help
right.
it.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah. I actually think that Carmen was really clear and really succinct. The only thing I think that I would add to that is that everybody has to recognize their position and play their position. So what I need to do in order to make that happen is not necessarily the same thing that Carmen needs to do, but we need to be working on the same thing. We need to be working in the same direction. And so I think that in addition to speaking to community, the relationships that we're building and that we have within community need to be nurtured and strengthened because there's a lot of pressure out there for us not to be successful. There's a lot of pressure out there not for us not to move forward. And so being clear about who we are and where we are in relationship to each other and the value of that, I think is critical for us to be able to realize and achieve the support that we're looking for. That's not a very clear way of saying it, but you know what I mean, right? Yeah, okay. Okay. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, going to go to Tina now. How can we secure the capital we need to bring communities' visions to fruition?
I would just add to that is that we just really need to be clear in what the ask is and to get input because a lot of times people, if they don't know what's going on, then they're going to automatically reject it. Or if they don't buy into it, then they're going to automatically reject it. And so I think that there needs to be a lot of work in making the vision clear and getting buy-in from people in the community so that they feel that they're a part of it, that it's not something that's being projected onto them, but that they have skin in the game. They have a piece of this. It's for them also.
All right, thank you. Okay, so just a quick note. First of all, give another round for our panel. Thank you, thank you. And I just want to own that I owe somebody a chair right now because I just ruined your chair. No, Boston. So, first of all, what is my stake in 30th in Chicago? My life. My life is at stake for 30th in Chicago. If we don't have generational black wealth that comes back to this community, then the same thing that happened to George Floyd might as well happen to me. So it's mentally, physically, and structurally and socially killing me on that corner if we don't get something out of what's happening. What would you like to see at 30th in Chicago? An anti-racist empowerment center, black incubation center, black businesses, black co-ops, something that we own generationally way beyond my being here and these people on the panel, and we just keep going and going and going. The last thing I want to see that comes out of that is generational leadership. So making sure that we're not following this model of the talented 10 and that we keep these leaders going and going and going, and that's what we're doing right now here in the park. What are the biggest obstacles for transforming that corner? The city of Minneapolis, their limited imagination, and their addiction to status quo and white supremacy. They can't, I've heard so many calls about that corner, and they cannot resist going back to business as usual. They can't resist it. And it makes me wonder sometimes if this city is reform proof. That's the business obstacle. And me falling for that as a community organizer and black leader and all the people that are standing around us right now and sitting around us right now, us falling for that, there's an old saying that if you let a man build your world for you, they're always going to make it limited and it's going to be a box. They're always going to make it too small for your dreams. And we cannot let the city of Minneapolis do that. We can't let these businesses and developers do that. So we've got to get those resources. And Lake Street right now is about to get a ton of money, and there's no reason why our corridor can't get a ton of money. We should be getting all the money right now for our corridor. It's the least they can do. That's minimum. Lastly, how can we secure the capital we need to bring communities' visions to fruition? Well, right now, there's a lot of money going around right now. There's a lot of foundations. There's a lot of, the city's got a lot of investments right now. I've seen the city shut down streets all around this city for no reason at all, except they just didn't want traffic to come through. So there's no reason why we, as a community, and we've already got a vision right now and a plan that we passed on the neighborhood level, there's no reason why they can't get behind it. And right now, let's face it, 38th in Chicago right now is a global, international, local epicenter of change. And there is an African-American man that I met who was a gentleman, and I met him at Congo when I was going dancing. And to me, he gave his life for that corner, and I need to give my life for that corner. So the least the city and the county can do is to make that an epicenter for change and for us in this community and the Black community to benefit from it. That's minimum. So I went last because I'm all about women going first. And so that's just the way I feel. And so once again, give a round of applause for this panel. And now we are going to go into our breakout groups. We have stakes behind us right now, corresponding with the blocks.
Let's count off.
Okay, we're going to do another count off. So we're probably going to go to 7. And so I'm going to have you count off in a minute. Go into your breakout groups. And before we go into these breakout groups, I'm going to read what we always read at this. And this: we are transitioning into a new society and a new world. We all get to shape that future, especially those who have been ignored. Black and brown folks, voices to the front in those groups if you're here, particularly Black folks. So we've got some group leaders here, and we'll take volunteer group leaders. We've got a series of questions for you, so we're going to pass those out. And then we're going to reconvene at 12:50. So let's do that count off now. Let me get on up.